This is Israel's Edge, the story of the IDF's most elite unit, Talpiot. Written by Jason Gewirtz. Narrated by Shlomo Zaks. This book is dedicated to my father, the most honourable person I've ever known, my mother, the most selfless person I've ever known, my brother, the strongest person I've ever known, my wife, the most caring and wonderful person I've ever known, my two girls, be whoever you want to be, but be good and do good. To all of Talpiot's past and future graduates, and to all the men and women who have served in the Israeli army, you not only guard a nation's border, you protect a people. Introduction. Each year, 50,000 Israelis reach draft age, and each year staffers in the Israel Defense Forces manpower offices start pointing young men and women in different directions. To tank units, to the infantry, to the Air Force, to the Navy, to artillery divisions, to special units designed to educate the underprivileged, to pioneering units, engineering, intelligence, the list goes on and on. Men are assigned to units for at least the next 3 years, women at least the next 20 months. This is a country that needs a strong fighting force, perhaps more than any nation in the world, and the army is idolized by its youth. In the years before their induction, motivated Israeli teenagers jockey for position, boosting their high school grades and preparing for special IDF induction tests. Hoping to earn invitations to enlist in the units they have set their sights on, thousands of young Israelis even sign up for physical fitness coaching and private pre-army training in order to prepare themselves for the rigorous physical IDF exams that will decide who is sent where. It used to be the Air Force that had first pick of these capable young men and women. They needed the brightest and most physically fit to fly complicated fighter jets, large transport planes and heavily armed silent attack helicopters, the fighting force that makes up the long arm of the Israeli Air Force. It was rare that anyone would say no to the Air Force. Like American boys who dreamed of becoming a baseball star, many Israeli boys hoped to grow up and serve their country by piloting an F-16. If the Air Force wasn't your goal, or if your eyesight wasn't perfect, another highly desired spot was a place in Israel's celebrated elite commando unit such as Sayeret Matkal or the paratroopers, with their distinctive red boots that symbolized to everyone just how tough you are and how dedicated you are to your country. But in 1979, something began to change. While the Air Force and top grounds units were still, and always will be, a very high priority for Israel, another unit, a secret unit, took over as top priority for the IDF. Soldiers picked for this unit aren't expected to fight like ordinary soldiers. Instead, they are expected to learn. They are selected from an ultra-competitive, grueling, fast-paced program designed to give them the best educational and military training possible. Their teachers are some of the world's top minds in mathematics, physics and computer science, as well as some of Israel's top strategic leaders from the Army, Navy and Air Force. The end game is to produce soldiers with great military and scientific backgrounds who are trained to think like nobody else in the world. They do not enlist like every other soldier in the IDF for 3 years or 20 months. They sign up for a full decade because the program is so intense, almost 1 in 4 of these bright minds originally selected won't make it through the program. Graduates of the unit are expected to accumulate massive amounts of knowledge and apply it directly to help Israel's deterrent shield, to help Israel's intelligence services and to make the Army, Navy and Air Force stronger in any conflict. This small, select group is expected to change the way Israel does battle. The country is counting on them to give the Israel Defense Forces an eternal edge over its enemies by developing the weapons and military hardware of the future. Since this unit became a part of the IDF, no other group of soldiers has had such a profound impact on Israel's defense doctrine, on how Israel's weapons are developed and how they're used. The military advantage these special graduates gave Israel didn't end when their army service was over. Those who left the army often took what they did for the IDF and applied it to the Israeli economy, creating hundreds of billions of dollars of wealth and tens of thousands of jobs in Israel and beyond. They have dramatically helped give Israel an edge on the battlefield and in global business. This is their story, the story of Talpiot. Chapter 1. A Devastating Force for Change. October 1973. The source tells his Mossad handler in London that war between Israel and its Arab neighbours is imminent. He's been wrong before, but with all of the other signs on the Syrian and Egyptian sides of the border, it looks like this could be the real thing. Agents from Britain to Israel are buzzing as they work their way up the chain to the director of the Mossad, Zvi Zamir. He flies to London immediately to meet with the source, a man now believed to be Ashraf Marwan, the son-in-law of former Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. The Mossad and Israel's other intelligence agencies had their doubts about the source, suspecting him of being a double agent. To this day, the truth has not been revealed. Zamir believes the information is credible and hopes the wheels of Israel's war machine will begin to move forward. He is able to convince Israel's Prime Minister Golda Meir and Minister of Defense Moshe Dayan of the impending attack. Despite having that crucial information, Israel's leadership decides not to act, fearing it will be blamed for firing the first shot and that Israel will thus lose critical support from the United States. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger has warned Israel's leaders, including Prime Minister Meir, that if war should break out, Israel had best make sure it isn't the one who starts the fighting. At noon, October 5, Israeli military intelligence reports state, the probability that the Egyptians intend to renew fighting is low. There is no change in our estimate of Syrian intentions. October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur, the 10th of the Hebrew month of Tishrei, 5734. At 2 p.m., Egypt attacks Israel. Syria follows suit a few minutes later. Israel is caught off guard as Egypt begins its assault crossing the Suez Canal, which had separated Egyptian and Israeli forces since 1967. The pace of Egypt's advance across the canal picks up speed amid cries broadcast from loudspeakers on Egypt's side of the canal. Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! God is great! God is great! Israeli troops stationed along the Bar-Lev line, constructed as an unbreakable defense against Egypt after the war in 1967, prepare to defend their lives and their country against the onslaught. For many Israelis trapped on the Bar-Lev line, this will be their final day. In the north, Syrian tanks pour across the border that had marked the ceasefire line established 6 years before. Syrian commando forces are helicoptered to Mount Hermon, taken by Israel in 1967. Syrian fighters and bombers fly sortie after sortie, bombarding soft and hard Israeli targets. Confusion reigns from the northern tip of Israel in the Golan Heights to the Sinai Desert in the south. Field commanders desperately try to stop the simultaneous advances from the north and south. Government leaders in Jerusalem are stunned into silence and worse, inaction, while army leaders in Tel Aviv initially dismissed reports of the attacks as exaggerations. It is impossible to believe their Arab enemies are capable of launching such swift and effective incursions. Didn't these same Israeli officers brilliantly thrash 6 Arab armies just a few years earlier? Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, the highest-ranking military official in the country, leads his closest advisers to believe that there is no problem. The situation is under control and the Israel Defense Forces will quickly turn the tide. Sirens blast throughout Israel on this, the holiest day on the Jewish calendar. Nearly all Israelis, religious or not, mark Yom Kippur by foregoing work, attending synagogue services, fasting, praying and contemplating. Bewildered Israelis stream out of their homes and synagogues. They gather around radios waiting for news, anxiously listening for the codes that will instruct reserve units where to gather. Israel's military brass had always contended it would need 48 hours to mobilize reserves, the backbone of the Israeli army, and intelligence agencies had always promised that giving 48 hours notice would not be a problem. Dead wrong. Israeli reservists and volunteers commandeer cars and buses hitching rides. Citizens beyond army age hastily arrange carpools to get soldiers to the places where hundreds of units have been told to assemble for orders. As the confusion in Israel grows, traffic backs up on the roads. Israel approaches panic mode, while Egypt and Syria approach the first-day goals they set for themselves during the months of planning that led to the October War, as it is referred to in Arabic. 48 hours into the fighting, Israel is suffering unprecedented losses on the battlefield, and the political leadership is having a hard time coming to grips with the turn of events. Sobering intelligence reports reach Dayan, detailing heavy losses and reports of Israeli positions overrun. Dayan's confidence evaporates. Egypt now has hundreds of tanks and thousands of troops on the Israeli side of the Suez Canal, an unthinkable scenario just a few days earlier. In the north, the Syrian advance continues. Syria's tanks close in on the edge of a plain that stares down on Haifa and the rest of the Israeli coast. As Dayan finally realizes the level of danger to his country, he gives chilling assessments of the situation to his inner circle and to other high-ranking members of the government. In his epic book, The Yom Kippur War, Abraham Rabinovich writes about an off-the-record meeting between Dayan and the editors of Israel's newspapers in an attempt to level with the nation. Sources told Rabinovich that Dayan said Israel might be forced to withdraw deep into the Sinai. The world had seen that we are not stronger than the Egyptians. The aura and the political and military advantage of it being known that Israel is stronger than the Arabs and that it would beat them if they go to war, this has not been proven here. A shaken Dayan is set to deliver a similar message to the nation that night, but one of the newspaper editors fears that the general will further erode morale and alarm everyone in the country. He reaches Prime Minister Meir and advises her to have another high-ranking military officer make the address to the nation. How did this fiasco happen? When the Egyptian surprise attack began on October 6, there were only about a dozen Israeli tanks protecting the road that led from the Sinai straight into Tel Aviv. How did Israel, mighty Israel, which had so thoroughly routed its enemies in the Six-Day War of 1967, fall to such a low state of preparedness only 6 years later? In the years between the Six-Day War and the start of the Yom Kippur War, Israel was engaged in a constant war of attrition with Egypt and Syria. There was daily shelling from behind the Arab lines, targeting Israel's military on the 1967 border and residential communities not far from those lines, especially in the north of Israel. Many nations that previously had supplied arms to Israel cut off arms shipments due to Arab threats. This was especially true of France, Israel's main weapon supply before 1967. The French were told that if they supplied Israel with weapons, the Arabs would cut off oil shipments to France. The United States picked up some of the slack, but not all of it, and Israel was left without a major weapons supplier. At the same time, Arab nations, especially Egypt and Syria, were showered with arms by the Soviet Union as the USSR tried to strengthen its hold in this complicated, energy-rich and critical part of the world. In addition to its immense success in resupplying their armies, Egypt and Syria made strides in training crews to man new weapon systems and rapidly advanced in planning strategy. All this happened amid an air of complacency in Israel. The country was still resting and satisfied with itself after the massive victory in 1967. Citizens, army officers, and the government thought there was no way Israel could be defeated. That smugness came to a swift end when war broke out in 1973. In the opening days of fighting, Israel lost 49 planes, compared to 46 planes during the entire Six-Day War. By the time the Yom Kippur War ended in late October, Israel had lost almost a fifth of its air force. Almost all of those planes lost by the Israeli Air Force were shot down by Soviet-made surface-to-air missiles. The Russian SAMs were so proficient that Israeli pilots would call them flying telephone poles, alluding to the wires that could snag a low-flying fighter jet, wires that were so impossible to evade at a low altitude. Those Soviet SAMs were so new and sophisticated, no air force in the world could dodge them. The Israeli military came to the shocking realization that the IDF was no longer in complete control of the skies. Israel's defense doctrine had been built on tanks and airplanes, and both were being soundly defeated by new technology owned by the Arabs. Air defense wasn't the only area where Arab nations had advanced their fighting technologies. Arab foot soldiers defeated Israeli tank columns with brand new portable AT-3 Saga wire-guided anti-tank missiles. The Russians called them 9K-11 Malyutka missiles. They were carried into the Sinai desert by Egyptian troops in suitcase-sized containers. Before the shooting started on October 6, Egyptian special forces passed through the Israeli front line on the Suez Canal with their new and deadly cargo. Israel's high command had some knowledge of the Saga, learned from American fighting experiences in Vietnam. But high-ranking Israeli officers did not believe Arab fighters would be strong enough or brave enough to confront Israeli tanks. They knew that in one-on-one battle, an Israeli tank crew could usually defeat its Egyptian or Syrian counterpart. Israel's tank crews were generally better educated and better trained than Arab crews. Moreover, Israel's tanks were more accurate and could fire from a longer distance. But they had not considered the Egyptian army's ability to use these sophisticated Sagas, and Israeli tank crews were caught totally unprepared. After stealthily crossing the canal, the Egyptians set up shop, hiding behind sand dunes and setting up traps that would easily ensnare formidable Israeli tank units. Military experts later confirmed that the Saga operator would find it much easier to hit a tank than the other way around, and at ranges that matched the tanks. Rabinovich, page 36. The large Israeli tanks made inviting targets for Saga marksmen. Egyptian specialists would lock onto Israeli armor more than a mile away, fire and destroy tank after tank with deadly accuracy. In contrast, Israelis searching for Saga crews in the vast desert sand could rarely locate them. This new element to the ground war would cost Israel dozens of tanks in the opening days of fighting. In the crucial early days of fighting, it became clear that counter-attack and reinforcement of Israeli troops would be impossible. Israeli tank reinforcements positioned 10 miles away from the canal were easy prey for those hidden Saga crews. When reserve tank forces tried to push forward to Israeli positions along the canal, they were picked off one by one. Communications failed as well. Less than 48 hours after the war began, with eyewitnesses reporting Syria and Egypt were using machine guns to kill scores of Israelis captured in the opening hours of the war, Defense Minister Dayan found himself having trouble getting through to commanders on the ground. At the same time, the Air Force was planning an operation to try to destroy Egypt's Soviet-made anti-aircraft batteries. Minutes before the mission was set to launch, Dayan contacted Benny Peled, commander of the Israeli Air Force, and called it off, diverting all planes to the north to stop the Syrian advance. His logic was that there was only sand in the Sinai between Israel proper and Egyptian tanks in the south. In the north, Israeli civilians were about to be in Syrian range. Without the Air Force, those population centers, including Haifa, were doomed. During the 5 a.m. conversation with Peled on October 7, Dayan said, "If our planes are not attacking by noon, the Syrians will reach the Jordan Valley." Then, for the first time, Dayan used a phrase that he would repeat in the coming days, to the dismay of all who heard it. "The Third Temple," he told Peled, "is in danger." The Third Temple was, and is still, code to many representing modern-day Israel. The first two holy temples in Jerusalem were destroyed in ancient times, the first by the Babylonians in the year 586 BCE, the second by the Romans in the year 70 CE. To many secular Israelis, as well as Jews all over the world, today's Israel is the Third Temple. The intelligence failures that led to Israel's early problems in the Yom Kippur War were dramatic and are still referred to today, more than 40 years after the war. But the war wasn't a total surprise to everyone in Israel. Some intelligence officers had seen signs that war was imminent. Soviet advisors and diplomats had moved their families out of the country in the days before October 6. There were widespread troop mobilizations in both Egypt and Syria. Arab troops were on the move en masse. There was also somewhat confusing evidence that the Egyptian and Syrian units mobilizing near the front lines were getting instructions to carry out training exercises. The idea was to move troops into position but allow Israeli spies and communication eavesdroppers to believe it was for the purpose of training only, not war. However, a more careful Israeli inspection would have allowed the Israelis to see that those troops weren't actually carrying out exercises at all, they were simply preparing for an invasion. If all this weren't enough, there was a direct warning from Jordan's King Hussein to Prime Minister Meir in person during a secret face-to-face meeting. In modern warfare, the side that fires first often has the upper hand. Waiting to be attacked is especially risky for a tiny country like Israel, which is only 60 miles wide at its broadest point. At its narrowest point, Israel is roughly 10 miles wide. Even a moderate thrust by the enemy could cut the country in half in the first hours of any war. Of course, Prime Minister Meir knew all of this, but decided to wait and hope for the best rather than risk diplomatic blowback, especially from the United States. She had been assured over and over by her military advisers, including revered Defense Minister Dayan, that if war were to break out, Israel would be able to smash its enemies again, as the country had done in 1967. When the shooting stopped and ceasefire agreements were signed 3 weeks later, Israeli citizens, the government and army woke up to a bitter reality. They were not invincible. 2,656 Israeli soldiers had been killed. Almost 9,000 others lay wounded. The backbone of the IDF, its formidable tank force, had lost 200 of its 300 tanks in the Sinai in the first 24 hours of the war. Scores of Israeli fighter planes were gone. The Arab armies had not only caught up, but had surpassed Israel in technology, subterfuge, strategy, and operational capability. Israel also lost in an area that was unforgivable. They lost the intelligence war. The trauma of the Yom Kippur War and the unrealistic fear that another war could mean extinction lingered. In the war's aftermath, the entire military establishment and political leadership were forced to resign. The Prime Minister and Defense Minister Dayan both left 8 months after the war ended. Key players in intelligence and in the IDF were ousted. For a nation born out of the ashes of the Holocaust to be threatened in such a way has a deep, scarring and lasting impact that affects every aspect of public life. A country of this size, surrounded by so many enemies, with much larger armies and with suppliers like the Soviet Union, simply could not risk another war such as this. For years, Israel existed in a state of quiet tension, and nobody really knew how to return to the sense of security most of the population had felt just after the Six-Day War. Everyone knew that Israel would never have the numbers compared to Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Algeria, Libya and Sudan. As the deck forever will be stacked against Israel quantitatively, it became clearer than ever that Israel needed a qualitative advantage. It was not long after the devastating Yom Kippur War that 2 professors at Hebrew University had an idea to give Israel that qualitative edge it so desperately needed and still needs today to survive. Their goal was to rearm Israel with enterprising mines, a weapon no army could defeat or suppress. Those mines would supply Israel with advanced weapons ahead of anyone in the world. But the professor's idea went beyond weapons. The concept was also to train those young minds to come up with new and better ways to monitor the enemy and to outsmart it. The inspired proposal wouldn't just help fortify Israel for the next war. Their innovation gave Israel the lead it maintains today. 4 decades after the Yom Kippur War of 1973, the edge Israel will have over its enemies for decades to come. Chapter 2: Talpiot's Founding Fathers. When the air raid sirens began on October 6, 1973, Hebrew University professor of physics Shaul Yatziv knew the government would never call for a mock air raid on Yom Kippur. Something awful and unthinkable was happening. Most Israelis had heard word of threats coming from Egypt and Syria, but like the government and the army, the civilians in the cities, villages and kibbutzim throughout the country knew little about Arab intentions. But when the silence of Yom Kippur was broken by siren blasts and radio announcers calmly but urgently began reading the codes to mobilize reservists, it could mean only one thing: war. Armed conflict was not new to Yatziv. Born in pre-state Palestine in 1927, he had lived through war and the threat of sudden violence from the day he was born. Following the declaration of Israel's independence in May 1948, he served in the first Jewish army assembled in 2 millennia. Yatziv was a full professor at Hebrew University, part of the university's Faculty of Natural Sciences. In 1973, he was conducting research on optical lasers and spectroscopy, the study of how matter reacts to radiated energy and vice versa. Like everyone else in Israel, Yatziv was shocked by the Yom Kippur War and its ramifications. At 46, he was too old to make a difference as a soldier, but he had another idea, an idea that would give Israel a real edge going forward. He knew that he would need to develop his concept and collaborate with others to make it a reality. He thought of Professor Felix Dothan, a colleague at Hebrew University with whom he had shared his research over the past 5 years. Their focus on lasers and potential future applications had been promising. But on Yom Kippur 1973, Professor Felix Dothan was far from the turmoil in Israel. On loan to the University of California, Irvine, from Hebrew University, he was personally safe, but quite agitated. His homeland was under attack, and he worried about his family and friends. In most countries, residents under attack run away from the fighting. But when war breaks out in Israel, Israelis living abroad often run toward the fighting. They return from wherever they're living, working or vacationing. When the war broke out in 1973, international carriers cancelled all service to the Middle East, but El Al flights were filled with Israelis rushing to get home to help, to serve and to fight. Professor Dothan was almost 50 years old in 1973. The country didn't need him in the army. It was more important for reservists of fighting age to have those airline seats. He would sit this war out, stranded in Southern California, left to nervously follow developments by reading newspapers and watching the evening news. He would have to wait patiently for word on the fate of his loved ones, including his son Yoav, who had joined the army at the age of 17, just 2 months before the war broke out. Usually, soldiers aren't eligible to join until the age of 18, but because of Yoav's academic acumen and with his father's written consent, he was allowed to enlist early. He was proud of his son's patriotism. It was the mark of a true Israeli, for unlike Shaul Yatziv, Felix Dothan was not a native of Israel. He was born Felix Deutsch in Zagreb, Yugoslavia in 1924. He had seen the dark side of life as a European Jew in his youth. Shortly after Yugoslavia had been occupied by the Germans, Felix and his classmates were told that the next day they were to assemble in the forest rather than report to school. Felix's father refused to give his permission and Felix stayed home. They later learned that Nazis and their Yugoslavian collaborators had shot 400 of his classmates to death. That wasn't the only time Felix narrowly escaped death. Later he was arrested along with his family by the Nazis, but managed to avoid deportation to Auschwitz due to the family's wealthy connections. Hidden by Gentiles till the end of the war, he finished high school and started at the University of Zagreb studying electrical engineering. But a resurgent wave of anti-Semitism in Yugoslavia and the realistic fear of being stuck behind the Soviet Union's Iron Curtain forever propelled his family to move to Palestine while they still could. They arrived in 1948. The War of Independence against 7 invading Arab nations was raging. The profound impact of his narrow escapes from the hands of anti-Semites evoked his deep loyalty to the newly emerging Jewish nation. Deutsch joined the army and worked his way up the ladder to lieutenant colonel in the Israel Defense Forces. After the ceasefire in 1949, he scratched out a living as a fisherman while continuing his studies in engineering and physics at the Technion in Haifa, graduating in 1951. The Technion is Israel's version of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, in the United States. He immediately took a position at the precursor to Israel's now famous Rafael Advanced Defense Systems in Jerusalem. The exact nature of his job remains classified, but it involved advancing the production, testing and manufacturing of new weapons for the army. He carried that experience to a new position, teaching and researching at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Hebrew U is an auspicious place for a researcher. One of its founders was the celebrated physicist Albert Einstein, and it had the backing of philosopher Martin Buber, psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, and Israel's first president Chaim Weizmann. Along with the Technion, it became the backbone of education in Palestine soon after opening its doors in 1925. Enjoying a gratifying career, he continued his research in Switzerland, later returning with his young family to Jerusalem and Hebrew University's new physics lab. There he worked with electrified gas and plasma, which has many civilian and military applications. After completing his doctorate in 1965, he hit the road again, accepting a position as a visiting professor in Geneva's Institute for European Nuclear Research. There he specialized in working on calculations regarding magnetic fields, design and lasers. A year after the pivotal Six-Day War of 1967, he became a senior lecturer at Hebrew University's Rucker Institute of Physics and changed his name from the European-sounding Deutsch to a Hebraic version Dothan. After fulfilling his role as visiting professor at the University of California, Irvine in 1973, Professor Dothan made his way back home to Hebrew University. When he arrived, he was shocked to find the confident, happy country he had left in 1968 in the midst of a crisis. Israelis had lost trust in their government and in the military. The mood of his once optimistic nation had turned decidedly pessimistic. Professor Dothan wanted to help get his beloved Israel back on its feet. The question was, how could he give such a gift to his nation? He knew the answer had to do with research and education, not military muscle, but even if he could come up with a viable plan, how could he get a military machine that's used to fighting wars with tanks and manpower to listen? It was time to revive collaboration with Professor Yetziv. Together they went to work, starting with a position paper to submit to Israel's top military officers. The paper states, "Concern for the fate of Israel and the wish to do the utmost to lower the number of casualties in future wars motivated us to submit a proposal that includes 3 important starting points that we do not have in existing research institutions." Their starting point: a firm recognition that the State of Israel must make an effort to develop totally innovative weapons that do not exist among the nations. This goal can only be obtained through human creativity that reaches its peak at the low biological age of the 20s. Inventive capability requires creative imagination, vast knowledge and deep understanding, but can be significantly encouraged by presenting challenges and creating a lively and motivating atmosphere where every effort and contribution will get encouragement from the surrounding environment. As one of the ways to reach this goal, we propose a systematic and condensed effort to invent and develop new and efficient weapons, where new is defined as a weapon that is not in use in other armies, even in the armies of the superpowers. It is essential that the core of this program will be based on the most talented and dedicated people who also possess the required background in the natural sciences and in the weapons technology. Their second point was to propose that the Israel Defense Forces would be directly responsible for the program and the people involved in it, specifically the Israeli Air Force. As mentioned earlier, the Air Force was the most venerated branch of the IDF. They took only the best of the recruits, people who could be entrusted with the most expensive armaments in Israel's arsenal. They needed math skills, the ability to understand advanced physics and aeronautics, great test scores, and the ability to think fast. Part of Dothan and Yetzir's proposal was to change that doctrine, to push the brightest and most motivated soldiers to their newly conceived program. In Israel, most students don't graduate university until they are 25 years old due to the 3 years of post-high school compulsory military service. If a student was accepted to Talpiot and then had to serve for 8 years as their plan stipulated, he would be behind his peers far too long, putting him at a disadvantage throughout his career. So point 3 of the original Talpiot proposal allowed for cadets to earn a Bachelor of Science degree in physics and mathematics, and later computer science as well, disciplines needed for engineers working on advanced weapon systems. The original proposal called for cadets to earn those degrees in 3 years rather than the 4 given to ordinary students studying those subjects. After completing their studies, they would serve in the army for an additional 5.5 years. Getting started, however, wasn't so easy. Dotan and Yatziv needed the IDF brass on their side and not just the Ministry of Defense. They needed support from Army and Air Force generals, other high-ranking officers in different branches of the IDF, and the all-important General Staff. Meeting with top generals, even in a country as small as Israel, isn't easy. In the 1970s, the army was Israel's most important institution, and many high-ranking officers didn't really want advice from professors or civilians. For 3 years, Dotan and Yatziv met with the military brass, only to be denied at every turn. This was especially frustrating to Dotan because he had ties to 2 of Israel's top generals. Both General Chaim Bar-Lev and General David Elazar originally came from Zagreb. Both had distinguished themselves in previous wars, and Elazar was the nation's highest-ranking officer, the Chief of Staff during the Yom Kippur War. But hometown nostalgia was not enough to get Dotan through the door. The truth was that in the wake of the Yom Kippur War, Elazar and all the top brass had troubles of their own that preoccupied them. Investigations into military fumbling during the war were being conducted by a special commission headed by Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Shimon Agranat. The commission's final report was issued in January 1975, and the impact on Israel's political and military leadership was devastating. In addition to Golda Meir, many high-ranking officers, including Elazar, were forced to leave the army, along with several of their top deputies. New leadership was brought in, but it would take time to rebuild the army's infrastructure. While the leadership was changing, the IDF was focused on quickly replacing armaments, tanks and fighter planes lost in the war. In the confusion, it is likely that nobody in the army had the time or the will to focus on a report from 2 outsiders. In April 1977, with the country still reeling from the after-effects of the Yom Kippur War, the Labour Party was swept out of office for the first time since the founding of the modern state in 1948. Menachem Begin of the Likud party had led the opposition for decades, and now it was his turn to lead Israel. Begin moved into the Prime Minister's office ready to make changes. Less than a year after taking office, Begin's Defense Minister, Ezer Weitzman, appointed Rafael Eitan as Chief of Staff, Israel's highest-ranking military officer. General Eitan was one of the Israeli officers credited with stopping the massive Syrian advance in the opening days of the Yom Kippur War. He had lost many of his soldiers in the fighting, but he escaped the war unscathed professionally. He had come from a disadvantaged economic background, but he revered education and saw it as the key to improving the prospects of less advantaged Israeli youth. With Eitan's ascension to Chief of Staff, new life was pumped into Dotan and Yatziv's drive to form an elite educated unit in the army. Their idea worked its way up the new and improved chain of command to the office of General Eitan. He was known to favour education, and because the structure of the army was changing, he had extra incentive to try new programs that would bear fruit in the years, decades, and generations to come. One day in 1978, after years of trying to break through the military's roadblocks, Dotan and Yatziv were finally called to deliver their proposal directly to Eitan. They arrived, proposal in hand, and spent a few minutes with the diminutive but imposing general. Then they were asked to wait in an exterior office. General Eitan had his secretary ask Air Force Colonel Benjamin Machnes to come to his office immediately. A pilot in the early days of Israel, the highly capable Machnus rose up the ranks. After his flying days were over, he headed a school that taught Air Force personnel advanced physics and aeronautics. He reported directly to the head of the Israeli Air Force, General Benny Peled. Eitan knew of Machnus' work at the Air Force School. Given permission by his commanding officer, Benny Peled Machnus immediately reported to General Eitan. He described their meeting. I opened the door, and Raful, nickname for Rafael Eitan, was waiting with General Israel Tal sitting there. Tal was our top tank general. He invented the Merkava. I said, "Hello, General Eitan. I'm Benji Machnus." Eitan replied, "Of course, I know you." He didn't even ask me to sit. He said, "Outside my door are 2 professors. I think they have a good idea. Go and do it. That's all." While Colonel Machnus was accepting the position as the Army's first representative in this new joint venture with Israeli academia, Yetziv and Dotan waited anxiously. Machnus let himself out of the office and introduced himself to the professors. He then told them, "Your project has been accepted. Let's get to work." Yetziv and Dotan looked incredulous. "That's it?" Machnus said yes, and the planning stages of Talpiot began right there outside of the Chief of Staff's office. A short time later, General Ariel Sharon was named Minister of Defense. He was quickly brought up to speed on the project. He told Machnus, "Benji, this is a good thing that you're doing." By Machnus' account, neither Sharon nor Eitan were particularly interested in becoming intimately involved in the program, but both were willing to gamble on it. Professor Dotan and Yetziv were given a mandate to start, and were urged to launch their innovative program in just a few months' time. There was so much that had never been discussed, so many questions looming that would demand foresight, creativity, practicality and fortitude. They knew they would have to scramble to meet such a pressing deadline, but at last they were underway.